Gideon, the trivial judge. In our last story, we learned how Jabin and his general Sisera oppressed Israel for over 20 years. The Lord sent Deborah, a mighty and wise woman. He also sent Barak, the commander of Israel's armies. They fought valiantly against Sisera and his 900 chariots. Sisera fled and was in the tent of a woman named Jael, and killed in his sleep with a tent peg through his skull. In this story, we learn about the oppression of Midian against Israel. God calls an unlikely judge, Gideon, to gather an army, as inspired by the book of Judges. Israel lived in peace. They worked the fertile land, built new homes for their children, and worshipped God. However, compromise began to creep into the house of Israel. A few idols were brought into the temple, and slowly the people began to stray away from God. It was not deliberate, but gradual and unassuming. Soon Israel found themselves caught in another cycle of total depravity. They did only what they thought good for themselves, not for one another. They became selfish and self-pleasing, and turned from God and His law. If history has informed anything, it is that turning away from God is the first step towards destruction. An evil was lurking in the caves above Israel, like a dragon hidden in darkness. The Midianites were dwelling secretly in dens carved in the mountains. Evil laughs and battle cries echoed through the canyons, and campfires lit up the mountain range. The evil horde descended upon Israel like a swarm. Whenever Israel planted crops, the Midianites and the people of the east would rise against them to devour everything in sight. Like pirates, they would pillage, rape, and burn Israel into dust. For 7 years, Israel desperately worked to provide their families with safety and food, only to have them stripped away in a storm of Midianite evil. They would hide their livestock and food in their tents, but the Midianites were like locusts, eating up all of it. The people of Israel cried out to the God they had abandoned. Once again, out of desperation, not love, they called upon the God that parted seas to save them. One morning, an angel of the Lord sat under the shade of a terebinth tree. A few yards away, Gideon was beating out wheat and storing it in a winepress to hide from the Midianites. Gideon was smaller in frame, paranoid, and constantly looking over his shoulder. He belonged to the weakest tribe in Israel, and he was the weakest brother of his family. The Lord watched Gideon work frantically, shaking in fear and fumbling about his work. The angel of the Lord spoke to him from under the tree, saying, "God is with you, mighty man of valor." Gideon leapt in the air out of fear, then saw it was not an enemy. Gideon walked closer and said, "If the Lord is with us, then why are we living like this? God has forsaken us and given us to Midian like a treat to a dog." Gideon spoke boldly, for he was skilled in the art of whining and complaining. The Lord smiled and said to him, "There is might in you. Take it and save Israel from Midian. I am sending you." Gideon laughed. "How could I save Israel?" he asked. "My clan is the weakest in this region, and I am the runt of my father's house." "No, you have the wrong guy." Gideon continued to laugh and began walking away. God said, "I shall be with you, Gideon, and you shall strike Midian down as a single man." Gideon turned back to him and said, "If you truly are the Lord, and I am truly called to be this hero of yours, then show me a sign." Gideon asked the Lord to stay while he went back into his house to prepare an offering. He prepared meat and cakes. He put the meat in baskets and its broth in a pot and rushed it back to the Lord. Gideon placed the offering on a rock next to him. "Pour the broth over the offering," God said. So Gideon made all of the meat and cakes sopping wet, dripping completely with broth. Then the angel of the Lord reached out the tip of his staff and lightly touched the offering. Immediately, like a match to oil, the offering was consumed by flames. Gideon started at the fire in amazement, then turned back to the Lord, but he had vanished in an instant. At that moment, Gideon had perceived that it really was an angel of the Lord he was speaking to, and fear came over him. That night the Lord spoke to Gideon in the quiet. "In your town there are many idols. You must remove them immediately," God whispered. Gideon, too frightened of his father and older brothers to do it in the daytime, snuck into the temple at night. Gideon was beating with sweat and constantly looking over his shoulder. He tied a rope around the altar of Baal. It was a massive statue looming over Gideon in the darkness. His torch illuminated the face of Baal staring down at him. Gideon cringed and tied the other end of the rope to his father's bull and slapped it. It ripped the altar of Baal from its foundation and came crashing down, shattering into 1,000 pieces. Gideon also cut down other idols that dwelled in the house. Then Gideon took another one of his father's bulls and offered it to the Lord. The men in town rose early in the morning and saw that the altar was shattered. "Who has done this?" they shouted. The men teemed with anger. "Who did this?" they shouted again. The people began to gather around the site of the broken idol. They searched around and spoke to every person except one, Gideon. "He has done this," they said with their jaws clenched. The men knocked on the door of Gideon's father, Joash. They burst through the door and said, "Where is your son? He shall die for what he has done." Joash panicked. He wanted to protect his son, but did not want to invoke the wrath of the city on himself. "So, do you fight all of Baal's battles?" Joash said, fumbling around his words. "If he is a god, wouldn't he want to deal with Gideon himself?" The men listened and stormed off. Meanwhile, the Midianite horde crossed the Jordan River and camped in a valley nearby. The Amalekites, along with some mysterious people from the east, joined forces with them and camped there. Their presence was felt by the people of Israel. Fear and hysteria ensued, yet something happened to Gideon. A small spark lit up within him. Something he had never felt before flickered inside him. The Spirit of God clothed Gideon like a suit of armor. Gideon's once cowardly demeanor shifted slightly. In a moment of bravery, Gideon called for the armies of Israel with the authority of a true judge called by God. He sounded the trumpet of war, and it echoed across the cities of Israel. Gideon sent messengers throughout the land to gather an army. The Spirit of God flew like an eagle across the country, igniting a fire of hope in the hearts of Israel. Men of war gathered to Gideon. The tribes of Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali picked up their swords and marched. Soon a vast army of 32,000 men stood at attention before Gideon, and he stood amazed by God. The battle was near, and the men were ready to follow Gideon to death and glory. Gideon retreated to a secret place to speak with God alone. The same self-doubt that Moses once had crippled the heart of Gideon. "How can it be me?" he whispered in prayer. "Lord, if you will truly save Israel by my hand, show me a sign." So Gideon brought out a fleece of wool and set it on the floor. Gideon said, "If you make this fleece wet on the dry ground, I will know it is you, and you have sent me." God did not enjoy being tested, but he wanted Gideon's heart to be comforted. So he made the fleece wet and kept the ground dry. Gideon spoke again, saying, "Do not be angry with me, but could you now make the fleece dry and the ground wet?" So God did as Gideon asked. This was a small reassurance that Gideon was supported by the God of all creation. Gideon rose to his feet, pulled his shoulders back, and marched towards his army.